Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tosh Talk. I'm going to do something quite selfish for the next following shows. I'm going to focus on my press, TamTam Books. And as hopefully you all know, every one of you should know out there that I publish the works of Boris Vian, at least all the major works by Boris Vian. And for those who don't know who Boris Vian is, he's a French author, translator, musician, songwriter, trumpet player, playwright. He was the prince of the Saint-Germain-des-Prés scene in the post-war years of Paris. Meaning from 1946 to his death, 1959, he was very much the socialite of that district in Paris. And that district in Paris, a lot of things were happening. A lot of writers were hanging out there. Besides Vian, there was Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and writers of that sort. Probably what we think of the existential French and the Situationists all came from the Saint-Germain-des-Prés left bank scene in Paris. And Vian was the main focal point because he started some nightclubs there, Club Saint-Germain and Taboo, which was like his early club, which he booked and helped promote American jazz musicians during that time. The occupation, the war years in Paris, all American culture pretty much stopped in Paris. And once the occupation stopped, American culture came in like crazy. Like all the American films made the last 6, 7, 8 years, all of a sudden were shown in Paris, as well as jazz musicians coming to Paris to play for, not the first time, but definitely probably the most important time. And it was also the height of the bebop movement. People like Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and in fact, I believe it was Vian who introduced Miles Davis to Juliet Greco, where they became a couple. Anyway, one of the key books of this time, though strange enough not successful at the time, is Boris Vian's Le Comme du Jour. I published edition of Le Comme du Jour, and we called it Foam of the Daze, D-A-Z-E. And it's now considered to be Boris Vian's masterpiece. It's a story about a gentleman named Colin who is quite wealthy, very young, early 20s, who lives in a very modern sort of science fiction house. He has a chef, cook, chauffeur, best friend of sort named Nicholas, who is basically based on Jeeves, P.G. Woodhouse's Jeeves. And Nicholas has sort of two identities. When he's working for him, for Colin, he has a butler role. But sometimes Colin says, "Hey, Nicholas, why don't you just have dinner with me?" And then Nicholas sort of changes his identity to like a best friend. So two roles there. And Nicholas's kitchen is very much devoted to 17th and 18th century French cooking, but he has he had a super modern kitchen which had eels, a certain type of fish coming out of the faucet when he needs the eel. He also had like sort of a stove that looked like a space machine in a way. It had a lot of dials and stuff like that. Vian's background was an engineer as well as a writer. So a lot of these inventions that he made for the book are kind of, didn't exist then, but it's possible. In fact, one of the great inventions of the book is the piano cocktail, which is a keyboard, a piano, which you play a certain melody and makes the cocktail to go with that song. And if you touch a key or a certain melody, instantly a drink is made. So it's sort of like a bartender, but the bartender is really the piano. So whenever you want a drink, you just request or play a certain melody, which is usually in the Boris Vian world always a Duke Ellington song. This perfect, beautiful cocktail come out of it. And so basically what happens is Colin has a best friend named Chick. And Chick is what you call otaku. He is totally devoted to collecting everything by this writer, Jean-Paul Sartre, to be not confused with Jean-Paul Sartre, which is, Sartre is actually a humorous version of Jean-Paul Sartre, who at the time when the book was written, he was a huge personality in Paris and the world eventually. And so Chick collects everything. He collects all like editions of his books, special editions, limited editions, but then also like starts collecting stuff like his sweat stains or his tobacco that he threw on the ground. He will pick it up, save it as being a Jean-Paul, a Partey collectible item. And all Chick's money went to collecting Partey's works and all the byproducts of his works. And in a way, he sort of became like sort of a drug addict or a gambler who can control himself. Any amount of money he gets, he would have to spend to buy a Jean-Paul Partey item of some sort. And then these two friends, they had girlfriends, and Colin meets a girl named Chloe, this beautiful, sort of perfect girl, and he marries her. And see, at this point in the novel, everything's kind of beautiful. Everything's like Technicolor, gorgeous, very surreal, sort of the ideal young person's life. But once he gets married, he comes upon illness, disease, and sort of depression, with not only with him but also with his friends. Chick's Partey buying habit gets worse and worse, almost like a heroin addiction, but like sort of the dark side of the heroin addiction. And even more worse is Chloe, his wife, develops a disease where a lily is growing in her lungs and slowly sort of strangling her. So the only way that Colin can fight this disease is basically purchase very expensive exotic flowers. And it keeps her at bay, but not really healthy. It just sort of keeps her alive. And as the more money he spends on her, due to her health problems, and Chick's problem with getting money or purchasing the Jean Partey books, things change. For instance, the rooms get smaller, things get more darker, things get more grayer. And I think overall the book theme is basically about youth, that is sort of a beautiful period, being young, and then all of a sudden it turns totally sour. So the book is very pessimistic, very dark. But Boris Vian's style is actually kind of lighthearted. This is a kind of a weird thing that's really hard to translate. But Vian is very, very heartfelt, but very cynical at the same time. Very romantic, but yet very anti-romantic. It's probably the closest thing to punk rock that I can think of, where it's sort of a romance, but a sort of romance of the gutter. And Vian, I think, pretty much loved the gutter. Also, From the Daze is a book that really deals with jazz culture of sorts. Not like specifically jazz personalities, but the love of jazz music and how that filters in their lives. And there's a lot of dancing scenes, there's a lot of music references in the book. And actually, with our edition, Brian Harper translated this book. We added, in the back of the book, we added endnotes, not footnotes, but endnotes. And it's meant to be read separately from the book. We don't want to have the footnotes interrupting the narrative of the book. So once you read the book, if you choose to, you want to get more into the Vian world, you can read the last, the endnotes, to get some more information about Boris Vian's life, his relationship with his wife, relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, translation issues that came up, and it's meant to be read separately. It's sort of like if you have a DVD, you see the movie, and then you got the bonus DVD, like documentary or interview. It's sort of set up that same way. So for this specific edition, and the only edition of jours, From the Daze, has endnotes that are quite informative. Now, this book has been translated 3 times altogether. In America, it was titled Mood Indigo. In England, it was translated as Froth in a Daydream. Totally separate translations, one by American and one by English translator, Stanley Chapman. And Brian Harper, who translated our edition of jours, From the Daze, is an American who lives in Paris. And the title, From the Daze, D-A-Z-E, jours is a very poetic title, and it's a very difficult title to translate into English. I think that's why in America, or Grove Press, this this is in the 1960s, decided to call the novel Mood Indigo, even though the song Mood Indigo is not even mentioned in the book at all. Duke Ellington is, but not the song. But I think they just want to avoid the translation issue. The Stanley Chapman translation, Froth in the Daydream, is pretty good. And I think Foam of the Daze, D-A-Z-E, is good as well, obviously. Of course, I prefer my translation, or Brian Harper's translation. When I agreed to publish the book, I had the choice of using either of those two translations that were done in the 60s, but I felt like it needed an updated version, and especially one with an American voice, because I feel, not only Brian felt this way, but also Paul Knobloch, who did the other Vian translations for me, feel that Vian's voice sounds it's really good in American English. There's British English and there's American English. And even though Vian sort of comments on British culture through Nicholas, his butler, who's sort of like Jeeves, you still need a sort of American attitude or American tinge to the language. And the foam of the days, so the creme de jour is means actually like the scum that comes from the sea, like when you're on the beach, the waves come and the waves go back, and what remains from the waves is sort of like the dirt or the scum, and that is sort of what the title of creme de jour means. Or foam of the days, D-A-Y-S, is another literal reading of the title, but I don't think Vian meant it to have that type of literal type of reading. I believe he wanted something that's kind of a pun, kind of psychedelic in a way of his own time. So therefore we call our version Foam of the Days, D-A-Z-E. And the book was written in 1946. Vian was very active as a writer from 46 to 1950-51. He pretty much quit writing because he wasn't successful. He was successful writing as Vernon Sullivan. In another episode I'll talk about Vernon Sullivan novels. But when the Creme de Jour came out in France, it was a moderately successful, not really a big hit, compared to his Vernon Sullivan books, which were bestsellers. So Vian was very much frustrated by this, that his more serious work was not much appreciated by the masses. And each book sold less and less and less. It wasn't until after his death in 1959, or actually in 1968, the May of 68, when the students revolt against the university in Paris, where actually all around the world students were revolting against authority at that point. The Creme de Jour, Foam of the Days, became a very prominent book for the students at that time, for people who demonstrated. And it's totally understandable because it's really a book about young people for young people, and it's sort of anti-aging, if that's possibly the case. I don't think Vian was a big believer in being mature. I think he actually has a more firm belief in youth and the power of youth. But he knows you can't stay young forever. In fact, Vian had a heart problem where he knew he was going to die young, and he did. He died when he was 39 years old. So he knew he'll never live to be old, which I think maybe, I'm reading maybe too much into this, but I think it affected his work greatly. So Le Creme de Jour is basically a book about youth turning old, which is bad. And also, Vian had a very strong anti-work aesthetic. He did not like working, meaning working in a job at a factory, even though he did have to work as an engineer, and he worked for a paper manufacturer for some years. I think when he wrote this book, he was working for a paper manufacturer, or a company that makes really fine writing paper. So again, Le Creme de Jour, Foam of the Days by Boris Vian. It's a masterpiece. It's a great book. And again, it really speaks a lot to young people because it sort of warns young people not to grow old. Sort of like children's literature in a way. Thank you very much, Tosh Talks.